My daughter died because of a lie my wife told for 15 years, and that was only the beginning of what she was hiding. Hey there, and welcome to the story of how everything I thought I knew unraveled before my eyes. At the time, I was living what you might call a new life, tucked away up in the mountains in a cabin that overlooked a quiet, snow-covered valley. Civilization was a distant memory, and that's exactly how I wanted it. This was my third winter out there, living off the grid, completely invisible. I guess I should back up a bit and explain how I got to that point. My name, well, the one I was born with, is Jack Morgan. It's funny, I've gone by so many aliases over the years that sometimes I have to really stop and think about what my mom called me when I was a kid. Back then, I was just another husband trying to hold things together. I'd been married to my wife, Caroline, for 15 years. What I didn't know, what I never even imagined, was that she'd been in love with another man for even longer than we'd been together. His name was Luke Adams. Caroline married me not out of love, but because I could give her something Luke never could. A stable home, a dependable paycheck, and a life that looked good from the outside. All the while, she stayed wrapped up in her secret world with him. Now, Luke was married too, ironically, to the daughter of a local crime boss. Her father didn't care if his son-in-law had a mistress on the side, but crossing his daughter? That was off limits. So Luke played both sides, and I was the clueless placeholder in my own marriage. The truth came out in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. One night, I got a call from the hospital. There'd been a car accident. Both of my daughters had been hurt, badly. My youngest, Emily, was in critical condition and needed an organ transplant. The doctors asked if I'd be willing to donate. Of course, I said yes immediately. But after running tests, they told me something I couldn't process at first. I wasn't a match. In fact, they said I wasn't biologically related to her at all. My older daughter, Lily, had also been injured in the crash. She couldn't go through the procedure herself. Her body wouldn't be able to handle it. We needed to find Caroline, but she was supposedly out of town at a 2-week conference. When we called, her phone was off. No one could reach her. Later we found out that the conference didn't even exist. Emily passed away that weekend. We couldn't find a donor in time. After the funeral, I ordered a DNA test for Lily. Deep down, I already knew what it would say. Sure enough, the results confirmed it. She wasn't my child either. When I told Lily the truth, it broke something in both of us. She realized her entire life had been built on a lie. Worse, that lie had cost her little sister her life. She looked me straight in the eye and asked me to make sure her mother never saw her again. She didn't want anything to do with Caroline. From that moment on, she chose to stay with me. Before I go further, I should probably tell you what I actually did for a living. While I was in the Army, someone noticed I had a talent for data analysis. That led me into military intelligence, where I discovered I had a knack for digging deeper than most. It wasn't long before the CIA came knocking. They offered me a contract role, the kind that comes with a lot of secrecy and no room for mistakes. I took the job. It wasn't the kind of opportunity you turn down. From there, I worked through a cover company, trained in cyber operations, and eventually became one of the top hackers on their roster. My wife never had a clue. As far as Caroline knew, I worked a boring office job and paid the bills on time. The money was good, and I never let her worry about anything. But after Emily's death, after those tests, everything changed. And that's when I made the call to my handler at the CIA. I told the agency everything. I laid it all out, what Caroline had done, what I'd discovered, and how close I was to doing something I'd regret if she walked back through that door. I wasn't proud of the thoughts I was having, but I knew myself well enough to realize I needed to disappear, for both our sakes. What I didn't expect was how fast the CIA would move. 3 days later, Julie and I were boarding a private jet owned by one of the agency's shell companies, heading west, leaving everything behind. Just like that, my past life vanished. Our bank accounts were wiped clean, closed without a trace. Credit histories, identification, every digital footprint, gone. It was like we never existed. Then came the fire. One night, the house where I'd built memories with my family, the same place that held birthdays, holidays, and quiet nights on the porch, was reduced to ashes. Nothing but the basement remained. The agency made sure there was no trace of the life we'd once lived. Caroline wasn't there when it happened. In some ways, that was a shame. I've often imagined her arriving at the airport, confused when no one was there to pick her up, pulling out her phone only to find it dead to the network. Then showing up to what used to be our home, only to find smoke rising from the ruins. No contact. No money. No explanation. Just the cold silence of what she'd left behind. She got exactly what she gave me. From that point on, Julie and I were known as John and Julie Martin. Our new home was a spacious 3,000 square foot ranch nestled deep in the hills of Montana, 350 acres of peaceful, untouched land. It was quiet, isolated, and perfect. The CIA had arranged everything. The place was wired and set up so I could continue my work remotely. They kept the systems maintained, the connection strong. My new identity came with a backstory. I was a retired novelist moving to the countryside to write in peace, away from the noise. Locals respected the privacy. I even had a few old books with my fake name printed on them, just to sell the illusion. Julie enrolled in a state university nearby. She loved it. Said it felt like the first time she could just breathe and be herself. I missed having her around, but I stayed busy. The work never really stopped, and to be honest, it kept me sane. Remember how I mentioned I was good with computers? Well, not long after we settled in, a certain set of financial records started mysteriously printing out across several FBI task force offices, specifically the Organized Crime Division. Somehow they found themselves in possession of every hidden transaction, offshore account, and backdoor deal ever made by none other than Luke's father-in-law, the infamous crime boss. The FBI didn't waste a second. Within a month, they froze every asset, raided multiple properties, and tore through the operation like wildfire. There were arrests, dozens of them. And amid the chaos, one more twist unraveled: a divorce. Apparently, Luke's wife had received a package containing records of every affair her husband ever had, plus details of his secret bank accounts scattered across the globe. Her lawyer practically threw a celebration. It was brutal and thorough. Luke's body turned up not long after, in a ditch off some back road, left for whoever might care to find him. As for Caroline, she vanished. No one saw or heard from her again. To this day, I still wonder if she managed to get away before the mob caught up with her. Or maybe she wasn't as lucky. Julie never asked about her mother, not once. The anger she carried ran too deep for curiosity. My second winter on that ranch was brutal. Cold winds cut across the land, and the snow piled up higher than the porch railing. But it was quiet, and quiet was what I needed. After everything, it was the first time in years I could breathe. That winter was brutal. There were stretches where the snow came down so heavy and so often, I'd be snowed in for weeks at a time. No visitors. No roads. Just me, the wind, and the quiet hum of solitude. One night, I was standing by the window, staring out at the snow swirling under the floodlights. It was one of those nights where the silence feels almost alive. Then, just on the edge of the light, I caught movement. My first thought? Someone had found me. Someone from the old life. Someone angry. Heart pounding, I squinted through the glass, and what I saw caught me off guard. It wasn't a man. It was a timberwolf. A massive one. He had to be at least 150 pounds, maybe more, and he stood tall, close to 4 feet at the shoulders. He looked wild, sure, but something in his posture told me he was hurting. Hungry. Desperate. The harsh winter had clearly taken its toll on him. Funny thing is, just the day before, I'd come across a deer that had been hid out near the edge of the road. I dragged it into the barn, thinking maybe there might be something salvageable. Turns out, the meat wasn't great, but I wasn't starving. That wolf, though. He looked like he needed it more than I did. Still, I wasn't going to be reckless. I knew better than to treat a wild animal like a lost dog. I flipped on every exterior light I had, just in case I needed a clear shot. Then I grabbed one of my rifles, tucked my .50 cal Desert Eagle into my waistband, and carefully pulled the carcass out to where I'd seen the wolf. After leaving it there, I backed off and went back inside, shutting the lights and locking up tight before heading to bed. The next morning, the deer was gone. Not a scrap left. A couple weeks passed. Then one evening he came back. But this time he wasn't pacing around the shadows. He was just sitting there, maybe 30 yards from the porch, facing the house. Watching. I still had some venison in the freezer, meat that was well past its prime. Tough. Not really worth cooking. I thought about it for a while, then geared up again. Same deal, rifle in hand, pistol on my side. When I stepped outside, he didn't move. He just watched. Come. Still. I dragged the venison out across the snow, toward the same clearing as before. As I walked, he quietly followed, never getting closer than 20 feet. Always keeping the meat between us. It didn't feel threatening. If anything, it felt familiar. Like two neighbors taking a walk. Two beings from different worlds sharing a quiet understanding. When I reached the spot, I turned to leave, walking backward to keep an eye on him. That's when he barked. Not at me, but at something behind me. I spun around, heart jumping into my throat, and locked eyes with another wolf. This one slightly smaller, leaner, standing stone still in the shadows. The big wolf made a few low, deliberate sounds toward her. She hesitated, then slowly circled around to stand by his side. She wasn't aggressive either. In fact, the way she moved told me something right away. She was his mate. That's when reality hit me. These weren't just two wolves in the wild. They were a pair. Partners. And I was standing in between them. So, I did what any sane man would do when faced with two apex predators on open ground. I backed the hell out. But they didn't chase. They didn't even lunge at the meat. Instead, I watched them work in sync, dragging the deer into the woods together, side by side. It was strange, almost moving, the way they moved as one. Later that day, I sat on the porch with a hot mug in hand, staring out at the same spot where they'd been. Something about that moment stuck with me, how even in the coldest season two wild creatures had found each other, and how, in some strange way, I felt less alone. Spring had finally arrived, and after months of snow and solitude, I found myself outside soaking up the fresh mountain air. The sun was warm on my face, the snow had begun to melt, and for the first time in weeks, the earth smelled like life again. As I walked through the open field not far from the house, I spotted a familiar silhouette in the distance. There he was, my old companion, the Timberwolf, watching me. I had my Desert Eagle holstered, more out of habit than concern. This wasn't our first encounter, and by now there was something almost friendly about his presence. He made a few sounds, not growls or anything threatening, more like curious vocalizations, almost playful. Then, without warning, he turned and began walking into the woods. He'd go a few paces, stop, look back at me, and then repeat the process. It didn't take long for me to figure it out. He wanted me to follow. So I did. We moved through the trees in silence, just the sound of our feet crunching over thawing ground and the soft wind brushing through bare branches. After about 10 minutes, we reached a small clearing. He paused, turned back toward me, and then did something I'll never forget. He walked over, gently pressed his massive head against my leg and closed his eyes. There was trust in that moment. A bond between two creatures who had every reason not to trust anyone. I felt humbled, maybe even a little vulnerable. But I stood there for a while, letting him lean into me, letting that silence say everything words never could. All through that summer, our connection deepened. The wolf and his mate would come visit from time to time, and I'd hike out to their den when the weather was good. There were no words exchanged, obviously, but the understanding ran deep. We looked after each other in our own strange way. Then came my third winter on the ranch, and it came in hard. A brutal January blizzard rolled through and parked itself over the valley. Snow dumped from the sky for days, leaving nearly 4 feet on the ground and wind-carved drifts higher than my truck. I was cut off completely, but my place was built for it. Generators, propane, backup food, even satellite comms. I wasn't worried. But the storm wasn't done with me yet. On the 4th day, I noticed movement near the tree line. I grabbed my binoculars and spotted something unusual, 2 dark figures, barely upright, struggling through the snow. I hitched the snowmobile to a small trailer and headed out, cutting through the deep drifts with the throttle maxed out. When I got closer, my breath caught in my chest. 2 women, barely conscious, frostbitten, and stumbling. I lifted the older one into the trailer first. The younger girl, likely her daughter, crawled in on her own, too weak to speak. Just as I was securing them with blankets, the wolf appeared, my wolf. He climbed into the trailer without hesitation and curled himself around the women, his thick fur pressed tight against them for warmth. That image, 2 humans nearly frozen to death, wrapped in the body heat of a timber wolf, is something I'll never forget. I drove them back as fast as I could, the wind biting at my face, my knuckles white on the handlebars. When we reached the porch, I carried them one by one inside, setting them down in front of the gas fireplace. The wolf followed closely behind. He disappeared for a moment, then returned dragging an old wall rug from the hallway, laying it beside the fire. He looked at me as if to say, help them, and then curled up nearby, keeping his eyes on them the entire time. Over the next few days, I learned more about what had happened. They were survivors, left to die in the cold. Apparently, the husband had tried to steal from his employer. That employer turned out to be someone you don't cross, a name I recognized. When the punishment came, it was swift and brutal. He was killed in front of his wife and daughter, and then the 2 of them were dumped in the wilderness like garbage. Officials later told me the women were lucky to be found at all. They planned to keep them with me temporarily, at least until it was clear whether they'd need to testify. After that, they'd be relocated with new names, new backgrounds, witness protection. No one mentioned the wolf. I didn't either. It didn't seem like the kind of thing you explain to a man in a suit. But we both knew he had found them. He had led me to them. And something inside him, something beyond instinct, had chosen to protect them. I decided to stick to my usual routine, for the wolf's sake and for the girl's peace of mind. Something about keeping things predictable helped all of us stay grounded, especially with everything they'd been through. To my surprise, I found myself enjoying their company more than I expected. Mandy, the younger of the two, took to my presence easily. She returned my hugs with grace and warmth, like someone who hadn't forgotten how to trust. Maria, her mother, was different. She trembled slightly when I first embraced her, her body stiff with apprehension. I didn't rush her. I held her gently, one hand rubbing her back in slow, calming circles. She didn't speak, but I could feel the walls she'd built around herself, thick and worn down by trauma, start to crack just a little. Later that day I saw the wolf again. He'd returned to his usual spot just beyond the tree line, sitting quietly watching the house. I asked Mandy to open the sliding door slowly and stand perfectly still, no sudden moves. She did as I asked, and sure enough, through the trees we spotted him. Mandy's eyes lit up immediately, but Maria was still unaware. I reached over, gently took Maria's hand and pointed toward the lawn. She followed my gaze, and the moment she spotted him, her hand tightened around mine with a strength I hadn't expected. Her grip was intense, like she was clinging to the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. The wolf stood, let out 2 short barks, and then returned to his post. A moment later, his mate appeared from the woods, standing a little behind him. I pointed her out to the girls and explained what I knew about their bond. Mandy asked questions, full of curiosity. Maria stayed quiet, just watching. It wasn't what you'd expect from wolves. There was no aggression, no threat. Just a kind of quiet reverence. Like they were keeping watch over us in their own way. As the snow melted and spring took hold, we began taking evening walks through the woods. Me, Maria, and Mandy. Mandy adored these walks. She'd ramble on about everything, trees, birds, whatever was on her teenage mind. I let her talk, happy just to listen. Maria didn't say much. But she held my hand. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't that kind of touch. It was more like she needed to know I was there. That someone was. During those walks, I'd often notice the alpha wolf nearby. He kept his distance, pacing along the ridgeline or just inside the trees, always watching. But he never approached us, not when Maria was with me. It was like he sensed her pain and gave her space. One afternoon, someone new arrived. Her name was Camellia. She was with a government agency, officially listed as a trauma counselor, though I got the impression there was more to her story. Sharp mind, gentle voice, eyes that had clearly seen too much. She was sent to evaluate the girls and help them adjust, or at least that's what the paperwork said. But there was something different about her. She didn't come in with the usual detached professionalism. She listened. Really listened. She laughed with Mandy, sat quietly with Maria, and when we finally talked one-on-one, I got the sense she understood all of us more than she let on. The next time the wolf showed up, I called Camellia over to the porch to introduce her. What happened next caught me completely off guard. Without hesitation, she dropped to her knees, arms open wide. My massive alpha wolf, this creature of the wild who rarely got close to anyone, wagged his tail, let out a few excited yips and trotted straight toward her. They embraced like old friends reunited. From that moment on, the two were inseparable. It was like he'd claimed her as one of his own. She talked to him like he was human, and he'd respond with sounds and body language that almost felt like he understood every word. Camellia even gave him a name, Ash. She started bonding with the girls more too, especially Maria. And somewhere in all of that, something shifted. The 4 of us, and Ash, began to feel like a strange little family. We'd cook together, talk by the fire, take long walks with the wolves nearby. Even when things were hard, there was comfort in knowing none of us were alone. Then came the day we discovered the pups. Later that evening, I tried to bring up what I'd noticed between Maria and the wolf. Maybe ask if it was safe or if she was really ready for that kind of connection. But before I could say much, Camellia stopped me in my tracks. She was calm but firm. Jack, she said, I need you to let me do my job. Don't step in, not with Maria, and especially not when it comes to the wolf. They're making progress, and every time you try to guide it, you're slowing things down. I didn't say much after that. I just nodded, trying not to let the sting settle too deep. But I'll admit I felt useless. Like I'd gone from being a protector to just a bystander in the life I'd helped piece back together. As summer gave way to cooler mornings and golden leaves, Camellia decided that Mandy was stable enough to enroll at the local high school. She'd come a long way, her confidence blooming like wildflowers after a long frost. She seemed ready to be around people again. Maria, though, was still hesitant. It took weeks of quiet encouragement from Camellia before she finally agreed to join me on a Friday drive to pick Mandy up for the weekend. The hour-long trip was mostly silent. Maria looked out the window, lost in her thoughts. I didn't press. I figured the silence was better than forcing a conversation she wasn't ready to have. When we pulled into the school's campus, Mandy was already outside waiting, practically bouncing on her toes. The second she saw us, she ran up, threw her arms around her mom, and pulled her toward the dorms to show off her room. Sorry, no boys allowed, she called back with a grin. So I waited in the truck. About half an hour later they came back, dragging a laundry bag so overstuffed it looked like it might burst open at any second. I couldn't help but laugh. It was the same way I used to come home from college, hauling weeks of dirty clothes to my poor mother. On the walk back to the truck, something changed. Maria started talking. Not small talk either. She opened up, telling stories, asking questions, just letting herself be present. We held hands as we walked, like we were teenagers stealing a moment before curfew. And for the first time, her smile didn't look like something she had to work for. Then I spotted him, Alpha, just off the trail watching. Without thinking, I gently pulled Maria to the side, trying to guide her away. But she stopped in her tracks and looked at me, calm and certain. It's okay, she said. He's my friend now. I owe him everything. Then, just like Camellia had done before, Maria knelt down in the grass and opened her arms wide. What happened next nearly stopped my heart. Alpha came forward, slow and measured, his eyes locked on hers. He let out a soft sound, then nuzzled into her chest like a dog greeting his person after a long day. They stayed like that for a while, just the two of them in the stillness of that early evening. From then on, it was like something inside her had shifted. The next morning at breakfast, Camellia casually mentioned she'd be heading into town and that Maria and I would be driving her. She added, almost as an afterthought, that Mandy would be joining us. We'd swing by her school on the way. Camellia had orchestrated the whole thing. Maria barely had a moment of quiet. Camellia kept her talking nonstop during the ride into town, questions, memories, funny little observations. On the drive back, Mandy filled the air with her usual chatter. By the time we reached the ranch, Maria looked exhausted, but not in a bad way. She was wound up, her thoughts still racing like they hadn't had space to slow down. That next morning marked her first day without Camellia around. And something was different. That night we went into town for dinner. Just the three of us. Maria surprised me by sitting next to me in the booth, rather than across from me like she usually did. She hesitated over the menu, overwhelmed by the choices, before finally picking the first thing she saw. When we got back, she quietly retreated to her room. No goodnight. No explanation. I let her be. But the next morning I woke up to a smell I hadn't experienced in years, bacon, crisp and hot, wafting from the kitchen. When I came downstairs I couldn't help but smile. Maria was cooking. That morning I walked into the kitchen to find Maria had made pancakes and bacon. The smell hit me like a wave of warmth, but what hit me harder was the smile on her face when I complimented her. Great choice, I said, grinning. She lit up. There was something in that moment, simple but real. Like she was slowly stepping back into the world after being gone a long, long time. Later that evening, a thunderstorm rolled through, loud and wild. I stepped outside to check for any damage. Loose shutters, tree limbs down, the usual. When I came back in and headed upstairs, I found Maria huddled in the corner of my bedroom, shaking, tears streaking her cheeks. The storm had triggered something deep in her, and whatever she'd managed to build that day had come crashing down. Without a word, I crossed the room, gently pulled her into my arms and led her to the bed. We climbed in together, fully clothed, no pretense, just two people sharing warmth and quiet. I held her close but kept a respectful distance, staying still as she cried into my chest. After a while, her breathing slowed and she drifted off. I didn't move. I held her the entire night, staying awake until nearly dawn. And when I finally nodded off, it was with the peace that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to trust again. I woke up a few hours later to the smell of bacon, again. But this time she was standing there with a tray in her hands, smiling. Please sit up, she said softly. I made breakfast in bed. That moment, it just about broke me. In a good way. The next afternoon, after I'd finished my chores around the ranch, Maria told me that Camellia had called. She was on her way back and needed us to pick her up from the bus station at 6. Maria was practically buzzing with excitement. Me? I wasn't so sure. At 6 sharp, we pulled up to the little station in town. Camellia hopped off the bus like she hadn't missed a beat, arms wide, pulling both Maria and me into a hug before immediately declaring, I'm starving. We took her to the diner and the three of us ate like we'd known each other for years. Well, they ate. Camellia and Maria sat together, shoulders touching, whispering and laughing in the back seat all the way back to the ranch. I drove in silence, listening and thinking. Camelia had always been a steady voice through all of this, but it had taken me a while to admit that she'd been more than just helpful, she'd been essential. The way Maria lit up around her, the confidence returning to her posture, it wasn't just healing. It was transformation. Before she left that night, Camelia pulled me aside. "Call me anytime," she said. "We'll talk." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Then she paused, gave me a look that stopped me cold. "I know this is breaking your heart." And just like that, she was gone. She saw it, plain as day, the ache I'd been carrying. The distance I'd been keeping from Maria, not just out of respect, but out of fear. Fear of falling. Fear of hoping again. The next day I picked Mandy up from school. Maria had called her to let her know she was leaving with Camelia for a while and that I'd be the one picking her up. But that was all she said, no details. So naturally, Mandy had questions. A lot of them. We grabbed dinner in town, just the two of us, and talked through the meal. I knew it was time. Time to explain the part of me I'd kept hidden for so long. After we finished eating, I looked her square in the eyes and said, "What I'm about to tell you doesn't go anywhere else. Ever." She nodded, leaning in. "I don't just live out here in the hills because I'm a writer," I said. "That's just a cover. The truth is, I work for the CIA." Her eyes widened. "Seriously?" she asked. "Dead serious." She looked down, thinking for a second, then glanced back up at me. "And if I ever mentioned that to someone else?" I exhaled slowly. "Then I'd probably be in danger. And so would you." When I told Mandy the truth, that keeping my cover safe meant keeping her safe too, she didn't say anything right away. But then quietly she started to cry. Through tears she said, "I guess I'd better keep my mouth shut then. You're too important to me to risk losing." That hit hard. We held each other tightly in a long, quiet hug. It was one of those moments that sticks with you, the kind that says more than words ever could. As I held her, I couldn't help but think about my daughter, Kim. If things had gone differently, she'd be about Mandy's age now. But Kim never got the chance to grow up. She needed both a kidney and part of a liver to survive. I offered to donate, of course. But when they ran the tests, the doctors discovered I wasn't her biological father. I couldn't help her. Julie, my other daughter, was too badly injured in the crash to donate, and we couldn't reach Caroline. She was off somewhere, unreachable, pretending to be at a conference that never existed. Kim died later that same day. After that, the CIA stepped in. They moved Julie and me out to Montana, gave us new identities, and made sure we disappeared. They even arranged for Kim to be buried on a quiet hillside just above the creek, a peaceful place overlooking the valley. I visited that spot many times but never brought anyone else there. Until Mandy asked. She looked up at me, eyes still damp, and said softly, "Can we go there? Can you introduce me to your daughter?" I didn't hesitate. We took a slow walk through the trees, not saying much but staying close. I could feel a lump rising in my throat the whole way. The weight of that loss never fully goes away. Later that afternoon, Camelia and Maria returned from their trip. After brief introductions all around, the four of them, Camelia, Maria, Mandy, and Julie, decided to take a walk together. I watched from the porch as they wandered through the trees, and then it hit me, they were heading toward Kim's grave. I grabbed my pistol just out of instinct and followed behind at a distance. By the time I got to the hilltop, I could see the four of them standing near the marker, each taking a quiet moment to introduce themselves. It was beautiful. And it hurt. I sat down nearby, out of their way, and just watched. A flood of memories came rushing back. Kim as a little girl, laughing, running through the yard, making jokes even when she didn't understand the punchlines. That evening, after we returned to the house, the mood was understandably heavy. Everyone gathered in the family room, quiet, thoughtful. The air felt heavy with grief. But I couldn't let that be the last word. So I started talking. I told stories about Kim. The funny ones. The mischievous ones. The ones that reminded us who she really was, not how she died but how she lived. It took a while, nearly an hour, but eventually one by one they all started to smile. By the end we were laughing. It wasn't just healing. It was necessary. Later that night, as the others headed off to bed, Camelia slipped her arm through mine and leaned in with a whisper. "I'm going to have to keep an eye on you," she said with a smirk. "I feel like you're after my job." Then she gave me a playful pat on the arm and walked off, her laughter trailing behind her. A few days later, after sitting with everything, I made a call to my handler at the CIA. I told him I wanted to track down the people responsible for Mandy's father's death. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. About closure. And honestly, about protecting what little family we had left. No child should have to grow up without answers, especially not when the people responsible are still out there. I had a feeling her father didn't just get in over his head. I believed he was forced into something, used as a pawn, and when things fell apart, the people who set the trap came after Maria too. That's how they operated. That's who they were. My handler agreed. Within a day, a file showed up at my door, detailing everything the agency had on the cartel, their network, and the men who had ruined so many lives. It was time to bring the past full circle. I began my quiet pursuit of revenge that very afternoon. It took nearly 2 months of patient digging, silent intrusion, and carefully placed digital footprints, but by the end of it, I had full access to the inner workings of the cartel's operation. Every offshore account, every backdoor deal, every name tied to the crimes that had touched Mandy and Maria's lives, I had it all. I packaged everything and sent it up the chain to Langley. A few days later, the message came through: "You're wanted in person, sir. Please follow me." They picked me up in an unmarked SUV, and our first stop was an Army airstrip. From there, I was escorted onto a military-grade jet, an advanced long-range fighter that looked more like something out of a movie than real life. The pilot handed me a helmet, strapped me in, and said calmly, "We'll be flying between 60,000 and 70,000 feet, just under Mach speed. Shouldn't take more than 2 hours." I barely had time to nod before the engines roared to life. The acceleration slammed me into my seat, locking my body in place as we cut through the sky like a missile. When we finally leveled out at 60,000 feet, I looked to my right and saw my boss sitting there with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. He leaned over and said, "Those two incredible women couldn't bear the thought of spending Christmas without you. So I said, 'Get in the SUV, you're all coming to dinner with me and my wife.'" And just like that, I found myself in the warmest home I'd ever known. That Christmas was the best one of my life. Maria and I were inseparable the entire day. I'll never forget one small moment. I'd stepped away for a few minutes to use the bathroom, and when I opened the door, there she was. "You were gone so long," she said with a playful grin. "I missed you, so I waited right here." That was Maria. Soft-hearted, silly when she let herself be, and fiercely loyal. Camelia kept a close eye on us, but she trusted me. I'd made a promise to be good, and I kept it. All I wanted was to be near Maria. Just being beside her was enough. The next day, they brought me to CIA headquarters in Langley. My boss took me on a tour, introduced me to the team, and I could feel it: respect. It was humbling. Like I was a war hero in a battle no one ever saw. Every handshake, every smile felt genuine. As the day came to a close, I asked if I could see Maria again before I left. But all they told me was, she had to leave. I didn't understand. Not then. A few weeks passed. One morning I was picked up by a convoy of black SUVs and taken back to Langley. Inside, my former boss, now retired, was waiting. He handed me a folded piece of paper, his expression solemn. "I'm sorry," he said. I opened it. It was Maria's will. As I read, my vision blurred. My hands trembled. I looked at him, not wanting the truth. "She's gone," he said softly. "She passed in her sleep, peacefully." He explained that she had been battling cancer for years. Every time they thought it was gone, it would resurface somewhere new. She'd never told me. She didn't want me, or the girls, to see her in pain. "She loved you all deeply," he added. "And she made sure we granted her final wish." They buried her quietly at peace on the hillside overlooking the creek, next to Kim. The girls came home the following weekend to say goodbye to their mother. We shared our grief in our own quiet ways, remembering her not just for her strength, but for the joy she brought into our lives despite everything. The following year, Alpha passed away. I buried him beside Kim and Maria, our guardian, our silent protector. It felt right. He belonged there, watching over them until I could take his place. Now I'm in my late 70s. I feel it in my bones, the weariness, the pull of something eternal. I've had a full life, a hard life, but not without love, not without meaning. A few weeks ago, I sent an email to the man who now holds the position my boss once did. I explained what I wanted. When the time comes, I want to be buried beside my family. On that hillside. By the creek. Where everything began. And where, someday, everything will finally come to rest.